you.
Now, item 9, the LTP 2021 mid-process update. There's an additional document been uploaded to the hub on this one quite recently. Peter, what I might ask you to do is just to take us through that attachment, or give us any highlights from that attachment, and any other matters from this report as well that you want to highlight.
Sure, thank you. Look, we're about to go into the crunchy part of the LTP. Between now and December is the tough bit. The objective is always, as you'll recall, to finish the year at Christmas with a broadly acceptable draft. So maybe not every last detail pinned down, but a draft LTP you can live with, because the wheels turn very quickly after that into February and the adoption of a draft. So between now and early December, late November, the process is set out here, and because you haven't had an opportunity to read it, I'll work through the document. Broadly speaking, the aim was to have an entire set of draft documents for you in June, and that was largely achieved despite the lockdown. We did take pause at that point, and rather than diving straight into the activities, which can lead you into the detail very quickly, we've actually taken some weeks there to work with councillors and ELT on big questions across the whole LTP before diving into the silos. So they're global parameter type questions, like, for example, what level of debt will you live with? What level of headroom do you want? What rates increase options do you want to see? What CapEx and OpEx envelopes are going to be acceptable? So getting those discussions underway, that's not a 1 hour meeting, that's taken some time. We're broadly placed with those now to dive into the activities. And attached to this report, you'll see a schedule of briefings for those activities, and they start very soon, like in about 10 days' time. That's been reordered so that the big activities come first. The reason for that is that they may need to circle back. So when you're looking at the big ones like parks, waters, transport, you may want to have that briefing, talk to the manager, look at their plan, and then ask for changes and then have them circle back. That's why they're first cab off the rank now. So just moving through, other factors involved. The external advisory group has been very active in this LTP. They're meeting fortnightly. I understand they provided their first briefing to councillors on the 15th of July. So, and there's another on the 25th or 26th of August from EAG to council. So you'll see in the report a briefing schedule. This means that if you've got an area of particular interest, you've got a clear heads up on when it will appear. These briefings are basically only an hour or so per activity. Now bear in mind that some of these activities like transport are $150, $160 million in OpEx. So a 1 hour meeting may not be sufficient if you want to make changes and then see them circle back to you. So this is a draft set of schedules. It's taken a lot to pull these time slots together. If you do need extra time, the thing to do will be to highlight it, and we'll work with OCE and the Mayor's office to make the extra time happen. But your time is at a premium between now and December, so it is a difficult issue logistically. Moving through to the mid-process update. Look, the LTP has actually been running for 8 or 9 months now. It has about 8 or 9 months to go before you get to a draft out for consultation. Overall, we had done well by June with the COVID-19 slippage, but we have fallen a little bit behind now, partly because of the need to take stock of the big global questions around the LTP, and partly because a couple of components are going a little slower than planned, and I'll talk to those later. The co-development process, whereby staff bring you drafts, not final product, you provide advice, they go implement that and maybe circle back to you, that process seems to be working well. It's quite a different approach to the 2018 model. The strategic direction has been strong. The Mayor's letter, or the Councillor's letter, says one of the process aims is to clearly demonstrate that the LTP is giving effect to the strategic priorities. The strategy team has been involved in all the meetings and has represented very strongly in that space. The infrastructure strategy, you had a briefing from yesterday on their most likely scenario and some detail around that. That was well received. However, what we do have to overlay on that are the financial constraints, and they're shaping up as pretty formidable. I'll come back to that when I'm talking about the capital prioritisation. The next step for the infrastructure strategy is to come back with you with more detail on the most likely scenario. And one thing to keep in mind right through this process is that we need to see a strong link from the infrastructure strategy to the capital prioritisation model to the actual capital projects you decide on at the end. That thread needs to run through them. It'll be something that Audit is looking for, and I'll talk about their Audit New Zealand is looking hard at New Zealand councils, this LTP, on about 4 distinct subjects, and I'll get to those in a moment. Financial strategy and activity budgets. The financial strategy was set back by having to do a second annual plan with COVID impacts in it. It's now catching up. We believe we've got enough information from you about the global parameters to know broadly the shape of the financial options. You would have seen Di Brandish yesterday presenting a single slide with options, some of which were shaded red as in not desirable, and others that are various shades of green to say, look, this is what you could do. It's important that you keep that slide in mind because it contains a combination of information so that you're seeing both CapEx, OpEx, rates increase all in one line as a recipe rather than seeing a single piece of information, which in this instance is not very helpful. So that slide is going to be coming at you again and again as to keep a very clear eye on the financial constraints around capital and OpEx. The other area where we've had some issues is in the savings themselves. There's been a lot of research done through the root and branch review, translating that to tangible savings, as in this would yield 400k, for example. That work has not appeared yet, and so that's a little bit concerning about the project. The activities will start to come at you in, as I said, about 10 to 12 days. So before they do, though, I need to frame the process. Managers have built those over a period of many months, surrounded by support staff from finance, IT, strategy, and so forth. By the time those activity plans get to you, they will have been worked through at a team level, signed off by the manager and the general manager. They will also have been to ELT for discussion, along with the savings options that are available. So they're not coming to you from the shop floor, so to speak. They'll be coming to you from a point of having been through a lot of filters. However, that doesn't mean they're final, locked down, cemented in place product. If you have feedback and changes to make, that's why they're scheduled early so that we can return them to you to see those changes. We've also provided a lot of guidance to activity managers on levels of service. There are too many. They need to be sharper, but without losing transparency. Again, that's a co-development process, so we'll be looking for a steer from you as well as a steer from staff to you. Asset management plans are available and will be part of this LTP for the first time on a transparent basis. They've probably suffered from not having strong financial parameters in their development, so the capital prioritisation process has to pick that up. At the moment, there is simply too much capital for us to afford or deliver, but bringing that line down is a key part of the LTP. You will recall that yesterday Carolyn presented, I think, the magma diagram as part of the options around capital. When you see that next, it will have been brought down to a more affordable level, and we'll have overlaid upon that the financial constraints. So you'll see a series of options around rates and where those rates would fall relative to that diagram. I can tell you that at first glimpse, it looks very much as though the most likely financial scenario falls not that high up the diagram. Meaning that by the time you do renewals and growth, there's not a lot of room above the line. So it'll mean looking hard at what renewals actually mean and whether they are real or or not. In terms of community and stakeholder engagement, there's been a lot of work to do it differently from past LTPs. Focus groups, participatory budgeting tools, they're all in place. The Smart Cities people have done a lot of work. So we're ready to have a conversation with the community. There's also a big session with community boards coming up in September, I believe, between you and the boards, where they present their plans. So we're 15th. Thanks, John. So we're poised to do, if you like, pre-consultation engagement more than we ever have before, but we do need a sense of where we're going with this before we have that conversation. In terms of oversight and LTP process review, the project currently has 6 layers of oversight. We have the LTP program group, the ELT, this committee, the external advisory group, audit and risk management, and Audit New Zealand, all providing oversight. One issue for me in terms of project management is that oversight is not a review at the end. It's actually active during the in flight, which means that it's actually eating into the availability of time to do the project. So we're trying to provide similar information to all those layers rather than bespoke 6 different sets of interviews and documents and so forth. The key one, of course, is Audit New Zealand, because they are the ones who have the legal mandate to review how we do the process, and they're the ones who publish an opinion on that, and it's part of our LTP. In other words, it's a public document. So they're really the ones to keep an eye on in terms of how this goes. So to summarise, key risks to the project. The financial strategy is catching up after the COVID impacts. We feel that we're on top of the parameters and choices now, and so the financial strategy needs to move ahead very quickly to catch up to the infrastructure strategy. Savings options need to accelerate more quickly. We need to make sure that capital prioritisation shows the financial constraints overlaid on the capital program, so that when you decide that that's an affordable and deliverable program, you're aware of the financial impacts and the links between capital and rates increases. And that's essentially the key areas of risk, is making sure that we've got the savings identified, and that when you see, for example, capital, that you understand the financial constraints around it. And that when you review the activities, the changes you make can circle back to you in time.
So, Peter, thank you very much indeed for that very comprehensive walkthrough. One of the purposes of putting this report in front of us on a monthly basis is to raise any red flags that there might be. And I hear, despite we've largely kept up, despite the COVID-19 situation and despite the rework of the annual plan, and I'd like to acknowledge all the work that people have done to keep up with the LTP at the same time as all of that additional work was done for the annual plan. And it sounds as though there are a couple of red flags that are being raised, particularly around the prioritisation of the capital programme, the realistic prioritisation of the capital programme, bearing in mind funding constraints and capacity constraints, and possibly around the savings from the zero-based budget approach. Are they on track, or when would we expect to have those on track? Because they're both key components that need to fold into the timely development of the whole package. So I wouldn't mind you making some comments on both of those areas of work if you're able to.
They're not irredeemably off track. We're in a position where it would have been ideal to have some of that stuff earlier. But having said that, it's more up to date now. And the situation, as you'll appreciate, is fluid. I mean, things could change today. What it's going to basically mean is, and there's probably a stages of grief process here, is that when we look at the parameters that councillors have put down around rates increases, the impact of that on both OPEX and CAPEX means that it will simply be a lot less than it was. And we've not worked through a process before of being that tight and disciplined around OPEX and CAPEX. There's always been a lot more room to move, the option of moving something around, a dividend appears, you know, something positive happens. Virtually none of those rabbits are going to appear from those hats. So in terms of an affordable and deliverable capital program, it'll mean a lot of discipline about what goes in it and a lot of questions about, is that an improved level of service or just our current level of service? Is it a renewal that needs to happen, or is it a renewal that could happen 5 years further out? So we're going to need to turn those rocks over to understand what a deliverable and affordable program is. And the same goes for the savings in OPEX. Will the organisation have sufficient capacity to deliver the service if we make savings at such and such a level? So in other words, it sounds like we have a lot of time between now and November, but actually to ask those questions and answer them, we don't.
So there are two areas of work that I'd suggest we need to land and get across as quickly as possible, realising that both are likely to have a number of iterations and are likely to take some time to land as well. So I guess, you know, coming back to my comment about the purpose of this report being to raise some red flags, they're two areas that we'll want to keep a tight focus on and that we'll want to get ahead of quite quickly, I think it's fair to say.
Absolutely.
All right, so thank you for highlighting those. Yeah, let's just keep an eye on that. Now, are there any other questions that people wanted to raise? Sam?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And probably just one thing in terms of the you know, we talked about the LTP parameters, so we've got to work through the capital program and the OPEX savings. One of the things that was flagged a while ago, and it may be a question for the team, was around understanding more the local government inflation and getting a better context of that, because looking at the parameters, you know, I still just sort of dispute where that's at. In terms of feeding that back to us, when will that come, do you know, or when is that available?
Look, I did do, after our discussion, I did do some homework on it, and to quickly round it back for everybody, the local government cost index for last year was sitting at 2.7%, and you raised some questions about that. So I got the team to go back and dig into it a bit. Those figures come from Burl, so that's the sort of benchmark that councils are meant to use, but they include both a public and private sector component around increases. So because councils pay a lot of private sector people, there's a private sector pay increase component to that 2.7. Now there's a very detailed document that comes from central government around how this is calculated and so forth. I've got that and I'll get it to you.
And the Burl update is due in October.
And as Di says, the Burl update is due in October. So we'll have a more accurate picture of 2020 view of the world,
yep,
and whether that 2.7 has gone up or down or stayed. But the science behind it is spelt out pretty clearly over about 6 or 7 pages.
Right.
And so it isn't purely a public sector view of the world. Because we pay earth movers and so forth from the private sector, that's built into those figures.
Right.
I'll get the detail to you.
That'd be really useful. And I guess just probably following on a wee bit from Andrew's one around the OPEX side of it again. So how are we going to, what's the best way to give the public oversight in terms of looking at how we do make those savings? So there's obviously the significant CapEx component, but looking at how we drill into that, I mean, I know they'll have a chance to make a submission, but how are we going to communicate that over the coming months? Because I think that's sort of something that's raised constantly with us.
Well, I mean, the stock answer is that the consultation document needs to spell out exactly what the savings options are and what preferred options council's taken. But that's all a bit late in terms of being a draft in February. If you wanted to talk or engage with the community earlier, there are mechanisms that the engagement team have built, but they don't have content yet because the content doesn't really exist. So we could work on a process whereby when you've decided, even on a general consensus basis, that this is where you want to go with some certain things, we could engage on that. But that's a process we've never done before. We need to think it through. Because you don't want to go out with something that you haven't really got agreement on or worked through.
Yeah. So I guess probably to put it another way, are we looking, when we do go out to that consultation or communicate, are we looking at going out and consulting on, for example, a reduction in staff numbers or a change in activities? Like how specific will that be?
Generally speaking, you would consult on the impact on the community, so the changes in the services they would get rather than the mechanics that sit behind it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you. Now I've got a number of other people with questions. I've got Jimmy, Sarah, Anne and Yanni. Jimmy.
Thank you, Chair. On page 80, the long-term plan, the briefing to the elected members. So based on this master schedule, looks like the EAG will present from now on, still have 3 times, but last time will be on the 8th of October. It's a final report, yeah. But if we review this schedule, after 8th of October, still have quite a few activity planned. The staff will present to elect members. My question is whether those ones minor one, not major one, so it should be okay or not.
Look, my understanding of the EAG is that they're not there to review every single activity, and
Yes.
that their focus has been on the ones that will be in September, the big activities. But they have split themselves into portfolios, and one of those portfolios is looking at the more internal services that are set down for October and onwards.
Yes.
So if they have any findings in that space, that should be part of their final report on the 8th. But their brief wasn't really to review every internal service on an individual basis.
Okay.
So I don't think they see that as their
No
role.
impact.
No.
Okay.
And in their discussions with Dawn, she was very keen to focus them on the big activities and the big issues rather than down in the weeds, as she called it.
Okay, thank you. The other one is the community board. We joined them on either 16 or 17 September. That's only one time, am I right?
That's one time before Christmas, but there's normally there's normally further interaction with the boards before the final LTP. This is really for them to present their community plans
Okay.
early enough in the process that those plans actually can join in,
Yes.
rather than there's not much point then presenting them after the draft is largely built.
Okay. If that's true, because after they have activity plans, still have some recreation sports, facility, etc. Whether they still eligible. Even now we review, or listen to the staff, but they are eligible to express their concern in a different community board. Am I right?
Yes.
Early stage.
Yes.
Okay.
That's,
thank
that's
you.
the point of that, fairly big meeting, is for them to have an early input and express their views on it. By and large, those plans tend to be at a fairly micro level.
Yes.
They're not really global network kind of views of the world.
Yes.
But if they're early enough, they can be incorporated into the plan. Or we can explain that what they're looking for is already in there.
Yes.
So there's a bit of give and take.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Sarah.
Thanks for that. Just on that capital program, looking at the renewals, what's needed, what's not, do we make sure that the costs of not doing the work are really explicit? So the risk of sweated assets, further financial costs later on, social and environmental costs, those kind of things, they're really explicit in the decision framework?
They have to be because, for example, and I alluded earlier to Audit New Zealand focusing on a couple of key things, this LTP, across the whole country. One of them is climate change. They're going to want to know how we're giving effect to climate change. And to that end, there is a good webinar by Taylor Tonkin, which I might circulate around to you. We discussed the other day. The letter of expectation is very clear about resilience and how we're giving effect to that, and lastly, risk. So there are a couple of key areas there where we have to say, when we're looking at this stuff, have we passed that lens over it? Are we actually giving effect to it in a meaningful way, or are we just having words and the detail, the implementation isn't there to support it?
Yeah.
So the short answer to your question is yes, that lens has to be there when we go through those discussions.
Yeah. But the auditors, they're going to be actually looking at what we're doing, not just that we've passed the lens over it. Is that right? So
Yes,
when we're looking at that future, decision making for future generations, they're not just looking that we've passed the lens over it, decided not to do anything. Are they?
No, they'll be looking that firstly there was a process, and secondly that we've actually given effect to it in some kind of meaningful way.
Yeah.
So, in other words, in the infrastructure strategy, are there waypoints that talk to climate change? Are there actions? Are there decision points built in around climate change, rather than simply some words at the top.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Anne and then Yanni. Anne.
Kia ora. Thank you, Peter. The briefing schedules, you should go into events schedule, planning. It's obviously a lot of work's gone into to getting this sorted. And what I just want to be clear about what you want from us as councillors when we come to briefings, apart from our attendance, of course. What would you hope to get from? Is it just a tick to say, yep, great, or do you want feedback? Do you want questions? What would you like from us?
There are some councillors who've been through this process before. We've done it each LTP since 2005. Essentially, direction and a critical eye. Is this where you want this activity to go? Balancing it against financial constraints.
Yep.
Are these the things you want it to do for the price that you pay? And is it transparent that whether you'll get them or not in the levels of service? So, in other words, are these the right things to be doing? Is this the right cost? And will we see on a transparent basis how well it's performing? They're the key questions. And in some cases, like we have managers who plan these right to a nicety, and you may say that's fine. In others, you may make adjustments. It depends on the quality of the plan and the direction that you as councillors want to go on a policy level. So the answer is it depends.
Right. So it would be good at the beginning of the briefing to actually just give those wee bullet points. This is the purpose. You know, that would be good just to remind us.
Yes.
Also, wondering about community engagement. It's fantastic that you're really working hard on that and how we're going to do that. But I'm wondering how the feedback that we get will feed into the actual process. You know, you kind of alluded to it when you answered Sam's question. We don't want it to become a cynical exercise where people would ask things and then not, you know, it doesn't go anywhere. So how do you see that working?
Well, I'm sort of speaking on behalf of the engagement team here. It's their area rather than mine. But look, their focus is not on a big blank sheet of paper, what do you want kind of question. They want focus groups that represent specific audiences and demographics. They want to put particular decisions to them. You know, there are big discussions to be had on, for example, red zone, take your pick. But it's about targeting the feedback rather than simply saying, what do you want? Because when you ask that broad question, you get stuff that isn't what councils do, for example. It's not that useful. So talking about rates increases would be one thing for the budgeting tool. Talking about specific topical issues for the city would be one for the focus groups and how it impacts them as youth or aged or whatever. So in other words, basically the approach they're going for is targeted rather than blank slate. And in order to do that, they require some kind of steer early on about what the LTP might look like. So the range of rates increases, the kind of big topics, whether we're doing climate change enough, those sorts of things. So in other words, it's garbage in, garbage out. If you ask a fairly specific question, you'll get useful stuff back. If you just say, what do you reckon, you'll get that back.
I think it's really great the way you're trying to bring people along with you in this process, both councillors and community, so appreciate that.
I think there's quite a lot of distraction at the moment, though.
Thank you. Yanni, you've got some question?
Yeah, thank you. Just two questions from me, thank you. The first one is, in terms of the hour-long briefings, are they going to include Section 70A reviews? And are they also going to be, when are they going to be available? When is the information attached to those briefings going to be made available to us as councillors beforehand to digest? Thank you. That's the first question.
If a 17A exists for the activity, it will come with the activity plan. So the answer to that is yes, if it exists. Not all activities have a 17A. In terms of availability, all of these plans, activity plans and asset plans, have been on Big Tin Can since March. But in terms of giving you a specific heads up, we're looking at somewhere between 7 and 10 days before the meeting so that you've got an opportunity to go through the plan, compose your questions and be ready for the briefing. So what we're absolutely trying to avoid is that the thing gets posted 2 days before and you haven't had time to read it.
Yeah, no, that's great. So if I, for example, the Linwood Library and the library's plan in the section 70A, there's a place in our Big Tin Can now where I can go and read all that information and be prepared for the hour briefing.
Certainly the activity and asset plans are, if a 17A is not complete, I don't know if it will be available because it's not complete. But anything that we've got that exists will be there. Okay.
So if a 17A is not complete, that raises another question. Then what's the point in having the briefing ahead of it?
Well, that's a good question, but the point is that 17As were due in June.
Okay.
So it would be good, and I realise you've got another question, Yanni, I'll come back to you in just a moment. It would be good where that's the case for us to know that at the time we're having the meeting. If there is a 17A that's still in flight, it would be good to know where that's it. It would be good to get any of those 17As completed prior, obviously, to those sessions if we possibly can, or at least get an update on where they're at if they're in a draft form. And I guess everything that Yanni has asked about Section 17A reviews would also relate to any service reviews that are going on as well, which are not formal 17As, but there's a service review in flight or being completed as well.
Yes, understood.
So, yeah, if we can fold that into the relevant briefings, that would be good, and obviously anticipating that there'll be questions about those where it's known that there are 17A reviews or service reviews going on, because, yeah, little point in having that work done if we're not going to have the ability to take it into account for the LTP.
Sure.
All right, Yanni, your next question?
Yeah, there seems to be a big gap, which is around development contributions. So I was just trying to understand, I've looked at the schedule, I can't see any briefing on development contribution policy and projects. I was just trying to get a sense of when we have that discussion, what the time frame is and how that feeds into all the other strategies that we're having to do as part of this.
Okay.
Thanks.
Two parts to the answer. One I do know the answer to, and that is development contributions were unhooked from the LTP some years ago by legislation. They're no longer a compulsory part of the LTP. Whether we're reviewing them in the same time frame, I would have to go back to the strategy people to see what their timelines are, but there's no obligation to review DCs in parallel with an LTP. No, we've got no one here who can speak to that.
Right.
I would need to talk to the strategy and planning people and find out what their DC review timeline looks like. But
okay, because I think this is, councillors will be, and the acting mayor will be aware, repeatedly raised the issue of looking at our DC's policy, so that areas such as in Phillipstown, where you've got huge intensification and development, none of that money that's being put aside for growth projects is going back there because there's no projects in our annual plan. Yes. And it's like a chicken and egg. We don't review the policy, but we don't have projects on budget, and we never seem to get any funding going from those developments back into the communities that they're impacting on. So I would just really appreciate having a really clear way in which we can consider that. You know, when you look at the DC's project lists, you can see quite clearly an assumption made around what should be funded through DCs and what should be funded through the budgets. And I would find it quite hard to separate that out with a separate process when we look at things like our capital project.
I understand. Look, I'll get a briefing back to you from the strategy people around that. You've touched on really quickly a very important part of the LTP, which is all New Zealand councils are going to be grappling over the next couple of years with what growth looks like. And DCs, of course, are partly predicated on growth. So if you basically forecast your growth too high, you'll have a revenue shortfall because that growth won't happen. And you'll be counting on DC dollars that aren't there. If you go too low, then you won't be getting DCs back that you should. So understanding growth and trying to get a picture of something that even the economists are all completely in disagreement over is going to be a feature of the LTP.
Yeah.
Nobody seems to be able to agree on what growth will be like because of the impacts of COVID and lockdowns and so forth. So, but we need to understand assumptions around growth for our LTP. So I'm just flagging that as one to chew over as we go, because the implication is in the millions. It's not small potatoes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yanni, thanks for raising that. And again, if we can make sure that that is folded into the briefing schedule, it's vital that that strategy and policy work aligns with this and that we can take that into account. And also any thoughts, and I guess it would come with that strategy and policy work around DC catchments as well.
Yes.
So it's the DC projects, the DC catchments, the growth projections, all key areas, particularly around what assumptions we're making and how we might set things up around those assumptions to get best value. So that probably comes back, Peter, to a point that you made earlier in the presentation around the time set aside for briefings. I'm aware in the discussions this morning that we've raised a number of issues that, we're asking for more time rather than less time. If that means that we need to further scan diaries and put a couple of placeholders in for further sessions so that we've got the time that we need, I'd be suggesting that that's something we should do as well.
Look, I think that would be extremely prudent because we haven't even touched on the Two Waters movement either, which is going to introduce other complexities into the LTP.
Yeah, I'd be suggesting that we put some further placeholders in. It looks as though we're going to be needing more time rather than less time, just with those issues that have been raised this morning.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Any further questions? All right, so we've got a resolution in front of us, which again I'm happy to move. Do I have a seconder? Jimmy Chen. Any debate? All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? That's carried. Thank you.
Thank you.